All right, everybody, welcome back to the Learning Out Loud podcast. I'm your host, Dustin William. I have my co-host with me, Whitestone.
I shall now attempt to show how the most important of these principia have been crystallized into the pithy form of maxims and have influenced and developed that grand system of truth known as equity jurisprudence.
The power is neutral. It's sitting in the quintessence until you invoke it. All right, welcome everybody to the Learning Out Loud podcast. I'm your host, Dustin William, owner and producer over at True Life Productions. You can find all of our content over at truelifeproduction.com, including all of the old episodes of the Learning Out Loud podcast. You can find the full 2-hour episodes over there for our first 10 episodes of the Foundation series, where we talk all about the equity maxims, the 20 maxims of equity jurisprudence. A thorough deep dive on that subject. And after that, you can check out All Aboard, Article 3 Articulations of the Thought Crime Dojo, all the extra good stuff. But that's all we got for the business today. I am ready to get into the topic we are about to talk about today, which is the third leg of the Trivium. Before we've in the last two episodes, we first covered the first leg of the Trivium, which was grammar, second, and then we covered the second leg of the Trivium, which is logic, and now we have made it to our third leg of the Trivium, which is rhetoric. And I'm really excited to get into this, but before we get there, let's introduce our co-host, Whitestone. How's it going, man?
I'm doing good. Looking forward to getting into it.
Yeah, right on. I don't think I have anything else I want to open up with today. Yeah, so I think we can just jump right into it then. Um, so first, before we do anything, obviously what we should do is get a little bit of grammar about rhetoric under our belt. So what we're going to do is start first with the definition of rhetoric here. Well, and I pulled this actually from 4 different spots is where I got the definition of rhetoric because yeah, as we were talking about a little bit before the call, there's I guess you might even be able to call it a misnomer about what rhetoric is today, because maybe what people think of as rhetoric today may be more accurately described of as persuasive rhetoric, which, as we'll kind of get into a little bit today, is not real rhetoric. That's the kind of rhetoric that politicians use on you every day when we're out and about. It's called persuasive rhetoric, and that's not how you're actually supposed to use this tool in the Trivium. Do you have anything you want to add to that, Whitestone? I know we were talking about it a little bit
Well, I
before
would
the
say
call.
that, a lot of times when I think of rhetoric, I think that word has been pathologized the same way that propaganda has, because propaganda
Hmm.
used to not have the same punch that it does today. It was simply a means to
Yeah.
describe a form of speech that bolstered an idea. And, rhetoric does kind of have a checkered past because, it's got an extremely long pedigree going back a long way, but also its misuse goes back just as far. And so many people will assume that rhetoric is just another form of propaganda, but in its true intent and meaning, it is in fact using the principles of grammar and logic into, like you said, a form of persuasive speech to communicate effectively.
Yep. Yep.
So
Exactly.
there's definitely, just keep that in mind that when we're talking about rhetoric, we're talking about just like inequity in its true original intended sense of the word.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, it's it's so funny you bring up the word propaganda and how words change over time. Isn't that crazy that Edward Bernays just named his book Propaganda? And
That
like
book is wild. If
nobody
you
even
can,
batted an eye.
I read that book and I kept having to is this a joke?
Right.
Or because I was like, there's no way they would come out and be like, well, in order to effectively control people's buying habits and thus, the underlying structure of society and its culture, we have to be able to, you know, uh, put all of our intellect together and speak to you in a certain way so that you act how we want. And it's like, you just wrote that out there for everybody. And that was,
N-
I mean, in the early 1920s, but that was before people realized that it could be misused. It was a new, fun, special tool.
Yeah, yeah, it actually they actually call it public relations now because it did get a
Yeah.
nasty stain on it. So now p propaganda is actually known as public relations.
But
So
to his credit, Edward Bernays did a lot to, I would say, damage the world. But I think near the end of
hmm.
his life, his mind started to shift about how it was being used.
I mean,
But
I would hope so. That dude, I mean, I would say he had more effect on the world than almost any other human in history.
oh,
He's
absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, and I know that the Crow 777 radio podcast has put I don't know even
mm,
how many episodes into him, and it's definitely worth checking out. The research is all there. But if you really want to get an insight into it, just grab his book Propaganda and read it. It's wild.
yeah, you really don't even have to read past the first page, and he spills all the beans right there in the
Yeah.
introduction of
And you
the
could even
book.
say that, propaganda is the result of misused rhetoric. And
Yeah.
so like propaganda is actually born out of rhetoric because rhetoric is just communicating effectively, but where the problem comes in is people use the words deceptively. While the logic is still there and the grammar is still technically correct, they're using it in a deceptive way, and they can then start using propaganda and things of that nature. So that's really what we're trying to get at the heart at is how do we take the fundamental principles of speech and turn them into effective speaking or
Hmm.
writing without it
Hmm.
becoming propaganda.
Without it becoming propaganda. Yes, exactly. That is the whole point behind us doing this. So, here in the first hour, what we're going to get into is we're going to get into some definitions, some etymology, and then we're going to get into the history of rhetoric. And then the second hour, we're going to get into what's called the five canons of rhetoric. And that's basically breaking down just how it works, basically the whole nuts and bolts of how it of what rhetoric is, and it's a very interesting subject. I learned a lot doing this, and then after that, we're going to go into rhetoric in the Book of Job in the Bible, which is something I've been working on for a long time. I've been studying, so I'm super excited to get into that. But before we get into that, let's start with some definitions. So let's start with the definition of rhetoric here. When this is from Merriam-Webster's dictionary, and the number one definition they have is the art of speaking or writing effectively, such as A, the study of principles and rules of composition formulated by critics of ancient times, B, the study of writing or speaking as a manner of communication or persuasion. Number two, A is a skill and effective use of speech. B is a type of or mode of language of speech. Three, verbal communication discourse. Synonyms. I like the synonyms they put here. Wind, nonsense, gas, jazz, oratory, bombast, fustian, and grandiloquence. I don't even know. I've never even heard that one. But
Grandiloquence.
grandiloquence. Oh, grandiloquence. Yeah, grandiloquence. Right, right. Yeah. That sounds like a good
Yeah,
word.
it's funny. To make a slight music reference real quick because they put jazz in there. The way that jazz is structured, well, I say jazz is structured musically, but jazz doesn't resolve back to its home note, and it just kind of keeps going and it just kind of keeps flowing. Doesn't really go, never really comes home. You really could just
Mm.
play forever. And sometimes rhetoric will do that too, where they can kind of just talk in endless loops and never really arrive at the point, but still somehow be convincing people.
Yeah, 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 absolutely. And that's kind of like peak persuasive rhetoric right there. And these rhetoricians and how they and
That's
a
called
great
Hegelian dialect.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Which
That's
yeah, we'll get into a lot on this show. Actually, I got some plans to put together j exactly on the Hegelian dialectic. Um, and I was gonna say, a perfect example of persuasive rhetoric, if you want to watch somebody live, is Barack Obama. He was a master at this stuff. Um, and you see that in his rating. Everybody loved Barack Obama when he was coming up. I mean, so many people voted for him. So, and just go back and watch his speeches, And you'll see a master of persuasive rhetoric. All of his inflections, his little, all of
It
that
all got to
stuff.
come together.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. I just look at the inflections where he places his words, the timing, all of it goes into it, man. And he was so good. He would have teleprompters on both sides so he can look at like 45-degree angles to make it look like he's not even looking at He was really good. If you want to study somebody, go study him. But
And that's what most people say too when they talk about Barack, is they
yeah.
say, "Oh, but he was so well spoken."
Uh-huh. Yep.
And that's what they
Yeah.
always hone in on. It's like, yeah, congratulations, you're picking up on the programming.
Yeah, right. He cast the spell perfectly on you. That's exactly what happened there. Um, continuing on with the definition of rhetoric here, this is from the Encyclopedia Britannica 11th edition. Um, it is the object is, oh, it says in there, the object is strictly persuasion rather than intellectual approval or conviction, which we've talked about the 11th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica a little bit there. We've see how it's been manipulated over time because that's not actually what that means. But this is from Aristotle's rhetoric, which this is what I would consider the source material on this because Aristotle's the one who really put all this together and really formalized rhetoric. He even credits himself with inventing logic, but he's the one that really formalized rhetoric. So and where is this? This is from, oh shoot, I didn't get the exact section this is, but this is from Aristotle's rhetoric. It might write it. I think this is actually right in the opening, but rhetoric, quote, rhetoric may be defined as a faculty or as the faculty or observing in any given case the available means of persuasion. This is not a function of any other art. Every other art can instruct or persuade about its own particular subject matter. For instance, medicine about what is healthy and unhealthy, geometry about the properties of magnitudes, arithmetic about numbers, and the same is true of the other arts of science. But rhetoric we look upon as the power of observing the means of persuasion on almost any subject presented to us. And that is why we say that it is in that and that is why we say that in its technical character, it is not concerned with any special or defined class of subjects. Of the modes of persuasion, some belonging strictly to the art of rhetoric and some do not. By the later, I mean such things as are not supplied by the speaker, but are there at the outset. Witness, evidence, given under torture, written contracts, and so on. By the former, I mean such as we can ourselves construct by means of principles of rhetoric. The one kind has merely to be used, the other has to be invented. So, but that second little part there, he's basically talking about what we've been talking about. It's the two different kinds of uh, rhetoric. The one kind is merely used, the other it has to be invented. And that's coming straight from Aristotle right there. And from the actual Trivium, from Sister Miriam Joseph's Trivium, they simply call rhetoric the art of communication, which that's my favorite definition of it right there.
Yeah, I like
Um,
that one as well.
yeah, simple, concise, right to the point. It's because that at the heart of it is what rhetoric is. So, um, we will now move on. So, what's the etymology of rhetoric? Where did this come about and what is it from? So, rhetoric is from the early 14th century from rhetorique, the art of eloquence and persuasiveness in language, the art of using language to influence others from the Old French rhetorique, and directly from Latin rhetoris, from Greek rhetorique, art of an orator, speaker, master speaker, orator, artist of discourse, teacher of rhetoric, especially um, orator in public. This is related to rhetoric, speech, word, phrase, verb, literally that which is spoken, since classical times, with a derogatory suggestion of artificial oratory as opposed to what is natural or unaffected. Ostentatious declamation. And that is the noun. The verb is a word, especially specifically in grammar, a word that asserts or declares that part of speech of which the office predicate is predication and which either alone or with variation, modifiers, or adjuncts combines with a subject to make a sentence. It is from Old French verb word, word of God, saying part of speech that expresses action of being, and directly from Latin verbum, verb, originally a word. Um, okay, so yeah, that's all the deeper we need to go into that. So two things from the Merriam-Webster's definition here are and B, it says the study or writing of speaking a means of communication or persuasion. So, one thing I wanted to know was what is the actual definition of communication? So, the definition of communication is the act or process of using words, sounds, signs, or behaviors to express or exchange information or to express thoughts, feelings, etc., to another person. And then the second definition is a verbal or written message. And then I got curious, what's the etymology of communication? So early 15th century communication, act of communicating, act of imparting, discussing, debating, or conferring from Old English communication and directly from Latin communicatium, a, ma a making common, imparting, communicating a figure of speech. Um, and then, what is the definition of persuasion or persuade? And that is to move by argument, entreaty, or expostulation to a belief, position, or course of action, to plead with, urge. And then the etymology of persuasion is to lead to the opinion or conclusion, make one believe or think, successfully urge the acceptance or practice of. So, I think that's enough definitions of etymology for now. But
Can I
so
add something to
that
that?
yeah, yeah, go ahead.
So it's interesting because really, when you get into the etymology of rhetoric, you kind of also start thinking about the original origins of when it was used. If you think about it, communication is an exchange between people where there's no physical or tangible thing being exchanged.
Mm-hmm.
It's getting another person to understand and feel your intent and your ideas from your perspective without touching them or giving them any kind of an object. So it really is you're it's almost like commerce of the invisible, because that's kind of what an idea is you're
Mm-hmm.
exchanging between one person to another person. And it got me thinking about the dualistic nature of, where we live is we can exchange physical things through commerce, and we exchange non-physical things through rhetoric. And so really rhetoric and commerce are at the heart of both of the ways at which we give and take things and ideas from one another. In my version of the Trivium, it says that rhetoric began in Greece as the quote
Mm-hmm.
be all and end all of public instruction and civic life. And so they're talking about using rhetoric in the public sphere and in the civic life. And we know that those words we're talking about the public side of government. And so it's no wonder that rhetoric is used at the highest levels of power to control how it is that ideas are flowed back and forth between people, the same way that they have a monopoly on the commerce as well, because that's the
Mm-hmm.
physical exchange. So,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's
so
a
it's
great
just,
point.
yeah. So anyway, it got me thinking, looking at how, rhetoric is broken down into communication and persuasion and the exchange of ideas. It's like, well, who has the monopoly on that?
Yeah, it's so funny that you bring up commerce and relating it to that because um, so from what I was looking up, and this, where did I get this from? This is from, so this, yeah, there's a place called Perseus.edu or whatever. They have all of Aristotle's and Cicero's work on there. That's where I pulled a lot of this from. So and they say they give they start with the very history, the founding of rhetoric. And this is when I saw I mean, it just solidifies everything that I already look into now, because this is what they have to say about the founding of rhetoric. This is a quote from, oh shoot, what? Uh,
Founder. It's interesting they use that word founder.
well, yeah, yeah, because they found it, because just like all these old buildings and stuff that we all talk about, they found those buildings just like they found rhetoric, because in my opinion, it's just a natural thing in nature. This is just a natural thing that we do. And really, Aristotle just kind of formalized it. But starting all the way from the beginning, this is what they have to say about the beginning of rhetoric. So quote here: Cicero has preserved from Aristotle a statement that forensic rhetoric came to its birth at Syracuse when, after the expulsion of the tyrants in 465 BC, many families whose property had been confiscated by them tried to reestablish their claims. Corax and his pupil Tisius assisted those who had been dispossessed of their property to convince the judges that they had a just claim to its restoration. So, isn't that interesting that the entire
Wow.
start of rhetoric was to get people's property back in court?
To be able to make a valid claim, they had
Yep.
to be able to use rhetoric to frame what it is that they were trying to achieve in a way that was favorable to them.
Yeah. Isn't that crazy, dude? I'm not gonna lie, that blew my mind apart when
Wow.
when I saw that. Yeah, because after everything that we look into, of course, that's the start of all this,
They had
is
been
getting people's
dispossessed
property.
of their property. And so they had to
Yes.
convince the judge that, yes, I'm still here. Yes, I'm still alive. Yes, this is here. This is my stuff. Here are my claims. Here's my proof. I've
Hmm.
lined it all out.
Which just goes to tell you that some things never change and some things stay the same, bro.
Yeah.
All the way from before Christ, 465 BC. That's crazy. Yeah, so credited. So this Corax guy, he is credited with being the founder of rhetoric, but and then he was the teacher of the Tisius guy, whom Aristotle credits with surpassing his teacher. So Aristotle talks about these two guys, um, I guess, being the founders of rhetoric, and so and why they make a big deal about that is Tisius, the student surpasses the teacher and all that stuff. Tisius is supposed to be one of the um, greats of all this stuff. So following the expulsion of Syracusean tyrants, so I haven't looked into the history of this. I actually don't know what tyrants they're talking about. I'm sure Rome is there in some way, but citizens needed systematic argumentation to press the land ownership claims before newly democratic courts. Correct. Of Syracuse composed the first known technique handbook of rhetorical principles organized around arguments from probability. His student Tisius extended the method and composed a rival handbook that Aristotle considered superior. Their work marks the conventional origins of Western rhetoric as teachable, transferable discipline. I should look up that book. I didn't have a chance to actually dig in and find that technique book. But yeah, I should dig into that. Um, yeah, that's about all I got on that one. So moving on from there, though, this is uh, so basically, so that is the founding of rhetoric, and then basically immediately after that, like not even 40 years after that, so the itinerant teachers known as sophists, principally Gorgi Gorgarius of Leotini, Protagoras of Abdera, and sorry guys, Thrasmachius of
All
Calderon
Greek to me.
yeah, right, exactly. Carried Sicilian rhetorical techniques to Athens, charging fees for instruction in persuasion. Operating within the law courts and public assemblies of Athenian democracy, they argued that mastery of speech was the highest form of practical power. Their commercialization of persuasion generated the philosophical critique of Plato and the more systemic response of Aristotle.
So
So
that was the
basic,
birth of attorneys right there.
yeah, exactly. That's it. Yeah, literally. So basically, that's where all of this stuff starts. Is the courts, and yeah, the very first people, not even 40 years after they discovered all this stuff, they start commercializing it and
Wow.
making money off of it. Yeah, isn't that crazy?
The highest form of practical power.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think yeah, this is when they're fine. This is when they're really realizing this right now.
Yeah.
And
Well, this is what, 427 to 380 BC?
yep, yep,
Okay,
yep.
so we've got what, about 400 years until someone comes along and says, "Damn you lawyers for my people perish for lack of knowledge," because
Yeah.
for the last 400 years they've been commercializing rhetoric and confusing everybody.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, dude, I even put a note on this first little part. Like it's just researching all this stuff. It just literally blows my mind that there was a time even before Christ. Because even like and knowing that rhetoric is from before the time of Christ, and then like it's almost like he came back to correct all this stuff as I'm reading as I'm reading and
Yeah.
finding out about all this. He comes and flips the table of the money changers and goes after the lawyers and everything, and that's like where all this stuff is starting is right here. And
That was the introduction of equity
yeah,
because
exactly.
they had all
Exactly.
these law courts and they had the commercialization of rhetoric, which was you could call what I would call the birth of attorneys. And then for
Yep.
400 years, there's only the at law side. That's
Mm-hmm.
it. And
Mm-hmm.
then finally, the Redeemer comes down. Now we have equity.
Yeah,
And it's like, look,
absolutely.
your systems of law are defunct. They are confusing. They do nothing but spread darkness. We got to be able to bring in a little bit of light because, you've been doing this for 400 years and it's not
Yeah.
working.
Yeah, yeah, man. Yeah. It's so and another thing I've been putting together because I've been doing a lot of research on the Protestant Reformation lately. And you know how we went through the whole history of equity and was talking about the King Henrys were the ones that really started the law courts.
Mhm.
Um, so it turns out that those were also the guys that were very prominent during the Protestant Reformation. So the Protestant Reformation basically coincides almost directly with the founding of equity courts, which I thought was very, very interesting. So that's something we're going to do a dive on later. But yeah, it's yeah, super, super. And as we know, John Calvin was a lawyer, so it's kind of making sense, but anyways, so let's move on a little bit further in the history um, of rhetoric. So, this is rhetoric as the foundation of civic education. If all who are engaged in the profession of education were willing to state the facts instead of making greater promises than they can possibly fulfill, they would not be in such bad repute. Isocrates founded a school in Athens around 392 BCE and argued that practical rhetoric grounded in ethical character, historical knowledge, and civic wisdom should be the cornerstone of all liberal education. His Against the Sophist rejected the quick formula techniques of rival teachers. The Antidosis offered the fullest account of his educational philosophy. His program rivaled Plato's Academy and directly shaped Cicero's model of idea, orator, statesman. Um, and yeah, and I would agree with him there that obviously that rhetoric should be the foundation of all civic education, and we talked about that a little bit in the last two. We've gone through a little bit of Dorothy Sayers' speech. I didn't use that speech as much, nearly as much as I meant to when we started this series, but I hope everybody goes out and reads it because that's basically her argument is that the the classical the trivium classical education should be the cornerstone, and I would agree. So
Well, you can't have a well-functioning, Republican form of government if only one class of people is trained in rhetoric and the other is not.
Yeah, and we're seeing the
And
fruits
so,
of that today because
yeah.
they took all of this out of our education system for it's been a very long time now, and we are reaping what we're sowing now because there's a certain class of people that were taught this, and everybody else wasn't taught this, and it shows for sure. Um,
Oh, and by the way, for people that are speaking of the public education system, the order of the philosophers, it's Socrates, Plato, and then Aristotle. So I always just
okay,
think of the acronym SPA, like when, SPA, because it's Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. So
right.
that confused me for a long time until I
Yeah,
finally.
and Socrates and Plato were around at the same time, weren't they?
Mhm.
Were they? Yeah, they were alive together. Yeah, I always get those three mixed up too. And it was Socrates and Plato. They really went after these sophists that we're kind of talking about right now. I've started really enjoying reading their works. It's really interesting stuff since I've gotten into this. But so and that's actually what we're going to talk about right here as Plato's critique, rhetoric as flattery and philosophical art. On that point, Socrates, I have heard that one who is to be an orator does not need to know what is really just, but what would seem just to the multitude who are to pass judgment, and not who is really and not what is really good or noble, but what will seem to be so. For they say that persuasion comes from what seems to be true, not from the truth. And this is from Plato's critique, and what he's talking about is the sophist right there, and he's basically going after the politicians for using persuasive rhetoric and not in a deceitful way, pretty much. So in the Gorgias, Plato casts rhetoric as a form of flattery that aims as pleasing audiences rather than telling truth, likening it to cookery rather than medicine. In the Phaedrus, he revised this position a philosophically grounded rhetoric, one that knows the truth of its subject and the nature of the human soul might be legitimate. These two dialogues define the normative debate over rhetoric's ethical status for more than 2,000 years. So, yeah, basically, Plato went back and forth on this. He thought it was all bad in the beginning, and then he does come around and say that maybe there are legitimate forms of this. We just got to get it out of the hands of these politicians, kind of like we're living through the day.
Well, yeah,
And
I
we,
think he realized it's like, without rhetoric being grounded in like what did he say? Philosophically grounded or
Mhm.
grounded in something that is absolute and true, then rhetoric can be misused.
Yeah. Yeah,
So,
absolutely. Yeah. And we talked about that a little bit last week with the logic point of it. If you did go through the grammar and logic portions of your education, you should fundamentally come to the truth in or to come to the rhetoric in truth. You shouldn't even be tempted to use the persuasive rhetoric because you should be properly trained as you go through these steps. But if you're not, then here we are. So, and then we get to Aristotle systematizing rhetoric. So, rhetoric is a counterpart of dialectics, for both have to do with matters that are in a manner with the cognizance of all men and not confined to any special science. Hence, all men in a manner have a share of both, for all up to the certain point endeavor to criticize or uphold an argument, to defend themselves or to accuse. Um, so Aristotle's rhetoric. So that's what that's where he systematizes it. Is Aristotle's rhetoric, which is readily available online. That's really all you have to type in. And there's digital versions, physical versions. I'm sure you can find a copy of Aristotle's rhetoric, and it's actually a very interesting read. But Aristotle's rhetoric is the foundational scientific treatment of the discipline. He defined rhetoric as the faculty of observing the available means of persuasion in any case and organize those means into three appeals: ethos, pathos, and logos. Ethos being speaker's character, pathos, audience, emotion, and logos, reasoned argument. He also classified three rhetorical genres: deliberative, forensic, and epidictic. Epide Epidictic. Am I saying that right? Epidectic? Epidictic.
Uh, epi epidactic.
Epidectic? I don't know. Everybody will have to look at that one.
That's a lot. That's some hard out loud learning right there.
Yeah,
That's what is that?
yeah, for sure. We
Epi.
should have reversed this one. Um,
Yeah, there's a lot of e's in that word. Good word.
Epidactic. That's the closest I can come. But anyways, deliberative is political, forensic is legal, and epidictic is ceremonial. So a taxonomy that endured through the entire classical and medieval traditions. And we are actually going to talk once we get to the Book of Job later in the episode. We're going to talk about a little bit, hit on all of these different methods that was used throughout the Book of Job. So that's basically the history of rhetoric and so yeah, so we talked a little bit going through there. We just got through the history of rhetoric and we talked a little bit about the sophist. So let's define what a sophist is. And so a sophist, when used as a noun, in number one is a philosopher. Number two, sophist, any class of ancient Greek teachers or of rhetoric, philosophy, and the art of successful living, which I thought was a very interesting definition for there. But for definition number three, they give a capacious or fallacious reasoner, which is yeah, I don't know. I guess I would say that the second definition of here is kind of dishonest because really, um, I wouldn't say sophist is a derogatory term, but it is a particular term of how to describe someone. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's because of the way they utilized rhetoric. And what did
Exactly.
Aristotle say that it was more like I don't know if it's kookery or cookery, but
Yeah,
they're they're
kookery. Yeah, yeah,
they're
kookery.
basically putting, cosmetics and stuff onto it to make it appealing in a certain way, which may or may not be entirely representative of the truth. And so I think that's what that's why they're almost like the casuistress, casuistry.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. It falls right in line with that. And let's just do a little etymology here and break these words apart. So what is sophist the root of? What word is sophist the root of? It is the root word of sophisticated. So all of these sophisticated people out there, everybody acts like being sophisticated is such a good thing, but really, I think it was around the 1800s they really turned that word on its head to give it this meaning, I guess, because the sophist were sophisticated. So sophisticated people were people who used rhetoric in a bad manner, but that I guarantee that's not what people think of when they hear the word sophisticated. But that is where it comes from. So, and who were the sophists? Um, so the sophists any of certain Greek lecturers, writers, and teachers in the fourth and fifth centuries BC, most of whom traveled about the Greek speaking world, giving instructions in a wide range of subjects in return for a fee. So, like as Whitestone kind of pointed out a little bit earlier, basically they were like traveling lawyers um, in the beginning. Uh, the term sophist uh, had early applications. It is sometimes said to have meant originally simply clever or skilled man, but the list of those to whom Greek authors applied the term in its early sense makes it probable that it was rather more restricted in meaning. Seers, diviners, and poets predominant, and the earliest sophists probably were the quote unquote sages in early Greek society. Oh, that's interesting. Where did I get that? Oh, that's from the Encyclopedia Britannica. Okay, interesting. So that's what the Encyclopedia Britannica says about that. So apparently, when the etymology of the word, where they were the sages, which I guess I I guess still kind of meets the term. It depends on how much credibility you give to sages of those times. Um, so you got anything you want to add to that before we start getting into what actually is the rhetoric here?
No, I think we should just jump in. I mean, I think that was a pretty good scratch at it.
Yeah, okay, cool. So we're gonna jump in, and this is from the Trivium also. So the this is a quote, the three language arts can be defined as they relate to reality and to each other. Metaphysics or ontology, the science of being, is concerned with reality, with the thing as it exists. Logic, grammar, and rhetoric have the following relation to reality. So now we've covered the sophist, we've covered the history, and we've covered like kind of how rhetoric has been manipulated over the ages. So now we're going to get into the actual what is rhetoric in its most pure form when you're using it in a legitimate fashion. So we're going to break down just a little review on what grammar, logic, and rhetoric are. So grammar and how they relate to reality specifically. So grammar is concerned with the thing as it is symbolized, the language that is used, the signs that are posted, the outline of any particular thing. Logic is concerned with the thing as it is known. How is the language spoken in its local dialects? What does each sign mean? And how do these things connect to one another or to create an effective mode of communication between the people in an area? So rhetoric, and I'm kind of correlating this into to like you're in a new area and meeting new people and you're learning a new area. Like say you got dropped into a new country, how would you use these things to move around? So rhetoric is connected with the thing as it is communicated. So rhetoric is quote rhetoric is the master art of the trivium, for it presupposes and makes use of grammar and logic. It is the art of communicating through symbols ideas about reality. So after one has been dropped into their new location and have sufficiently studied the people's culture, understanding the language and on more than a base level of being able to order a pizza, the orator now has enough knowledge to continue through his journey of education through the strange land, not having known anything before he arrives. So, to kind of further break this down is like we've talked about a little bit, and as Dorothy Sayers talks about in her speech in the Lost Tools of Learning, as grammar, logic, and rhetoric not being subjects that you study, but rather a system of learning that kind of builds on top of each other. So they're so always building on top of your grammar, but you are never done with the first pass of any subject. As you make the connections and start communicating more with the locals, you will inevitably pick up more grammar, causing you to use your logic to put the information in the right place, then rhetoric to further communicate the ideas and understanding to other people, starting the cycle once more. So these things are all working in conjunction with together. And this doesn't just go like if you're dropped into a new place. This is like if you're learning any kind of subject, these are the kind of principles that you're going to learn to use and utilize and learn the subject more fully. And you're going to kind of keep dipping in to each of these subjects as you're going through and you're educating yourself. Um, so do you got anything you want to add to that?
No, no, I like that.
Okay.
It really is just rhetoric is the live application of logic and grammar, you know, in order to communicate. And just
Mm,
I really think that the bad rap that rhetoric gets is because it can be stylized. And when it's
Yeah.
stylized, it can be edited and things can be
Hmm.
omitted, or emphasis can be put on certain areas. Like you said, if you get into a new area and you really start to pick up on their tradition and their language, you can see a lot of the things that are important to them. And then you can use the tools of logic and grammar to persuade them to make decisions they wouldn't have otherwise made.
Yeah. Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
which is
Absolutely.
really what I mean. That's what kazooitry is too. Um, it's the same thing. It's taking things which are mostly true, which can be proven, but the way that they stack them is suspect.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And the way you combat that, and that we talked about the way you actually combat that, and you can actually write these things on paper and figure out the truth of them or not. If you just have a little bit of base knowledge from your grammar, in studying the subject, you can actually plug these into the equations that we talked about last week, and that's how you can actually logically come to your truth and really pick apart these arguments. And and if you want to practice, go pick apart Barack Obama's speeches, knowing what you know now, and you could really see rhetoric in its full effect right there if you really wanted to do a study on it. Um, so now, um, before we start getting into what the five canons of rhetoric are, we're just kind of break down how language works a little bit. So this is a quote from page 9 of the Trivium. Quote, the language arts guide the speaker, writer, listener, and reader in the correct and effective use of language. Phonetics and spelling, which are allied to the art of grammar, are included here to show their relationship to the other language arts in material functions and norms. So we're going to start with phonetics. Phonetics prescribes how to combine sounds as to form spoken words correctly. And phonetics is one of my favorite subjects. Um, so, and then spelling prescribes how to combine letters so as to form written words correctly. Grammar prescribes how to combine words so as to form sentences correctly. And you see, as we're kind of building on top of everything here. So, logic prescribes how to combine concepts into judgments and judgments into syllogisms, which we talked about last week, and chains of reasoning as to achieve truth. Rhetoric prescribes how to combine sentences into paragraphs and paragraphs into a whole composition having unity, coherence, and the desired emphasis, as well as clarity, force, and beauty. So, rhetoric is the finely sharpened knife that the student ninja receives at the end of the lesson. Able to wield the sword responsibly, you are able to use the words to persuade people to your side of the argument. Depending on what situation you are in, will determine on which type of rhetoric you will use. If the scientist is in a room full of lay people hearing a topic for the first time, he will use an entirely different rhetoric than if he were in a room full of his peers and scientists of other fields. Quote, because rhetoric aims for effectiveness rather than correctness, it deals not only with the paragraph and the whole composition, but also with the word and the sentence, for it prescribes that diction to be clear and appropriate, and that sentences be varied in structure and rhythm. So that's kind of a whole breakdown on how all of when you're speaking that because this is more geared towards like when we're talking about rhetoric, all of this everything we've been talking about here has been more geared towards actually like giving speeches and talking, but all of these things can also be applied to like maybe writing an essay or something like that. Any written words can also be that you can apply these same things to, but a lot of the when people talk about rhetoric, they're usually talking referring in a talking manner. So, do you got anything that you want to add to that before we get on to what the actual we're going to talk a little bit about the five canons of rhetoric before we move to outer two.
No, that's perfect because my version also has the five canons in it as well, so it would be nice to compare.
Oh, okay, cool, cool, perfect, Perfect. So, all right. Yeah, before we jump into hour two, then we'll just we're gonna cover go over a brief overview of what the five canons of rhetoric are, and then we're gonna go into a deep dive in the second hour of these canons, and then we're gonna hit rhetoric in the book of Job. So, just to give a brief introduction into what we're gonna get into. So, what is this quote from? This is okay. So for this is from a quote from Aristotle's Rhetoric. Rhetoric is the counterpart of dialectic. Both alike are concerned with such things as come more or less within the general kin of all men and belong to no definite science. Accordingly, all men make use more or less of both. For to a certain extent, all men attempt to discuss statements and to maintain them, to defend themselves and to attack others. Ordinary people do this either at random or through practice and from acquired habit, both ways being possible. The subject can plainly be handled systematically, for it is possible to inquire the reason why some speakers succeed through practice and others spontaneously, and everyone will at once agree that such an inquiry is the function of an art. Quote, the modes of persuasion are the only true constituents of the art. Everything else is merely accessory. Um, that's kind of it. Aristotle's talking about how these how you're using how these five canons are kind of used um, and derived from nature. So the five canons of rhetoric are the classical framework for organizing the entire art of persuasive speech, from the initial discovery of what to argue through the structuring, styling, memorizing, and final delivery of the argument. They are not simply a pedagogical checklist. They are the theory of communication that maps the full cognitive and performative process a speaker must undergo to move an audience from indifference or opposition to conviction. The framework was consolidated in the Roman tradition, most authoritatively in the anonymous Rhetorica ad Herennium, which I drew a lot of this information off of, in Cicero's De Inventio, De Orator and Orator, and in Quintilian's Institutio Oratoria, but it draws directly from Aristotelian tradition and was transmitted in variant forms through Augustine, Maritinius Capella, Isidore of Seville, and the medieval university curriculum. The five canons and their standard Latin designation are invento, the discovery of arguments; two, dispositio, arrangement of material; elocutio, style and language; memoriam, memory and internalization; pronunciation slash actio, delivery. So those are the five canons of rhetoric, and in the second hour we are going to do a deep dive into how all of those relate to each other. And just like how the Trivium builds off of each other in grammar, logic, and rhetoric, these five steps build off of each other also. And we'll be able to see that clearly in our breakdown in the second hour. So do you got anything? Is that how it's broken down in your copy of the Trivium,
Yeah,
Whitestone?
there's the five. There's invention, arrangement, style, memory, and delivery.
Okay, so they just give it in the English. Okay,
Though the
cool.
Latin's there, I just didn't want to
Oh,
butcher
okay.
it.
Yeah. Yeah, just like I did. So
Yeah.
yeah, right on. Yeah, so we hope to see everybody over on the second hour. This is a great little introduction to what the history of rhetoric and how it's been manipulated over time. So now we've broken into it a little bit on, how is it that rhetoric is properly used. So in the second hour, that's what we're going to get into is the five canons of rhetoric, and then the book of Job, and how rhetoric is used throughout that entire book, and how Job finds grace. So that's all we got for the first hour. Hope to see everybody over in the second hour, and never forget to seek truth and honor the Creator above all, and let that be the whole of the law.
That's the important thing here, is that everyone's word should be meant for a use.
And the words that I'm using today are meant to pull down idols within people's temples.
Meaning that I want to destroy
Falsities that they have idolized.
for their entire life.
And just pull those out and sweep them clean. And before that temple,
And get reinfested with a new lie. Give it true life.